Recording. So, hello everyone. Today is the third webinar by Andy Curtis, our great friend, and I believe a really interesting presenter for most of you. I am giving floor to Andy, and he will tell more about what he would like to tell today.
Thank you, Marina. I'm just going to share the screen. Thank you for your greetings. Natalia, it's good to see you again. And those of you who've been here before, very nice to be back. I'm just going to host disabled participant screen sharing. Okay, so I have a message that says I can't share my screen. But I will keep.
Let me allow you to share your screen. Yeah, so just a second.
Natania, Julia, welcome. It is a lovely, bright, sunny day here in Kingston, Ontario, Canada. Bright blue skies, lots of clouds, and kind of cold. But
you can share your screen. It says
okay.
it says that you can share your screen. Please try. Yeah.
Okay, I will try that. How's that?
Yeah, we can see your screen now.
Great. Okay. Thank you all very much. Welcome. If this is your first time, welcome back. If you've been with us before, this is my third online webinar for TESOL Ukraine with TESOL Ukraine. And I have talked in the past, as some of you will know, about associative learning, this idea that all knowledge is connected. So our first session by request was on intercultural communication. Our second session was on assessment and this notion of an ecosystem of teaching and learning and testing and assessment. And for our third one, building on those first two, it seemed like a good idea, partly coming out of the questions that you asked, to look at creativity and critical thinking in the foreign language classroom, in the English language classroom. So thank you again for joining us. And I'm assuming you can see and hear me clearly. There will be a recording. So for those of you not able to join us today, you can look at the recording. Please feel free to type questions into the chat bar. I should be able to see them, and I will be happy to address those questions. So moving on, we are still teaching and learning in a time of war, but last week we were able to meet Marina, myself, and the woman in the middle is Brigitte Schwartz, who is from Israel, another country experiencing a great deal of armed conflict, as is Ukraine. I should also say Happy Easter, Good Friday to those of you who celebrate the Easter weekend. In this case, I was listening to Pope John Paul's benediction earlier today. So we were able to meet in person. Online is great. Online is wonderful, but it, in my opinion, is never going to replace the magic of meeting in person, as Marina Brigitte and myself were able to do in Tampa, Florida last week. About 1,000 presenters. And one of the big topics, some of the big topics were AI, artificial intelligence, and Chat GPT, a lot of interesting presentations and concerns about Chat GPT and how technology may or may not take jobs. Personally, I don't think it will. I think what we do as teachers is too profoundly humanistic and profoundly interactive. So thank you for your greetings. It's great to see you and to see some of you again. That's a little background on myself. The only relevant point is that after more than 30 years, after being TESOL president, after 200 publications, I tend to see myself more as a resource than an expert. Some of you have heard me say this before. I have published in a lot of different areas and done a lot of different research. Now I'm doing research on artificial intelligence and Chat GPT. But I'm at an age and a stage where I prefer to see myself as a resource rather than an expert. And as a resource, I hope you'll make good use of me, and I will always leave enough time at the end for questions and comments. So, creativity. The American Psychological Association, the APA, which is most widely known for its referencing system, does actually do a lot more than provide a referencing system. So this is their definition of creativity. And if any of you have any thoughts on that definition, do feel free to post them into the chat bar. So originality is big. The notion of something new is very big. But as a psychological association, they spend a lot of time considering what do we mean by creativity, how do we develop it, how do we assess it. So I started there. I believe that all good teachers, all of you that are here today, are very creative people. I would love one day to be able to sit in some of your classrooms and confirm that belief, that teachers are some of the most creative people I've ever met, and I've worked in a number of different disciplines. A family member was in hospital recently, and so I got to spend a lot of time in hospital. As some of you know, that's my background: clinical, medical biochemistry, obstetrics, gynecology, and pediatrics. So it was really interesting to see creative experts in a very different field working to help someone who was in a lot of pain. So creativity is not unique to our field, but I do believe that language teachers and language learners are some of the most creative people I've met, having worked in a number of many different disciplines. So that's their definition. And as I say, I encourage you to pop questions into the chat bar, and there will be time at the end for questions as well. Those of you who have been at some of my previous talks know that I'm very big on context. I have published entire books on the notion of context. And whilst Marina, Lena, many other teachers from Ukraine were in Tampa, Florida last week, I saw a lot of really good talks, but for me, one of the differences between a good talk and a not so good talk, Marina and her co-presenters gave this inspiring talk on the work they've been doing. And one of the reasons that I really liked the talk and others like it was because they really pay attention to the context. So my position is a little extreme. I'm a person of extremes. And for me, context is everything. And so some of the presentations that I went to last week at TESOL 2024 in Tampa, Florida, USA, didn't really take into account the context. They seemed to feel that America was somehow the world, and America is very important in the world, but it's not the world. And we had over I was told 4,000 teachers. I counted personally 50 countries, but I'm told there were many more countries than that. This is why context is so important, because when I talk to you today about creativity and critical thinking, you should be considering, well, what does that mean for me in my context? So as those of you who've been here before know, I'm very big on context. I research the context of the teachers that I'm presenting to. I mean, in this case, Ukraine. And so one of the papers I read is this one. And I only refer to papers that are freely available online for anybody with a stable, secure internet. I don't recommend books and articles these days that are kind of hard to access, especially if you're in a place of armed conflict or a war zone. There's no point in me giving you a book list. So this is a paper I can recommend. They looked at teachers and students in Ukraine and Portugal, which was an interesting comparison, and found some interesting aspects of creative thinking, role playing. They actually found that many of the Ukrainian teachers that they interviewed had a positive attitude to role playing. So if any of you use role play in your teaching and learning of language, let's say English, please do make a note in the chat bar, because I would love to know. They said 84% of the Ukrainian future engineers used, their teachers used, and in fact, Yulia used it just today. It's great. Natalia's used it quite often with students. So I don't know why. I was kind of surprised by that, because many of the contexts I work in Asia, I commute between Canada and China, which is a really, really long commute. But in many of the Asian contexts that I'm in, um, I find my students quite resistant to role play. So this is great, because role play is an extremely creative way of engaging with a target language. So um, I'm happy to see that some of you used it today. Some of you use it quite often. The newness and the novelty is, of course, a key factor. New associations, new information sources, interdisciplinary links. Again, many of the presentations that I most enjoyed last week at TESOL 2024 did make new associations in terms of connecting foreign language teaching and learning in ways that I hadn't really thought about before. So the newness and the novelty is an important aspect of creativity. You may or may not be familiar with these articles. If you are, please do let me know. But there's quite a number of articles in the last couple of years that have come from teachers in Ukraine about creativity. I'm showing an example from a couple of years ago, 2022, from a publication called Amazonia Investiga. Several co-authors, some of whom you may know, I don't think any of whom are here today, but if you're one of the co-authors, that was a really interesting paper. So do let me know about creativity in higher education institutions. And there were these two words in Ukrainian that I was trying to pronounce, but I don't know how to pronounce them. One is creativist. So creativist versus tvorchist. I was practicing those today, so my apologies if I'm saying them wrongly. But this notion of creativity and the creative process, I thought was very interesting. Um, and I was happy to see a lot of articles. I came across and read many articles about creativity in your context, mostly um, before the war. So I hope we can look forward to a time after the war where I think it's too hard to be creative in the middle of an armed conflict, unless that's what the creativity is about. So um, I look forward to a time. Thank you, Olina, for my Ukrainian pronunciation. I appreciate that. I think most people become language teachers because we really love um, languages and cultures and other languages and cultures. And certainly last week in Tampa, I was able to use what little language I have in many different languages, which was tremendous um, fun and very creative. And as Natalia says, a great deal of learning and a great deal of healing uh, has to occur. It's a it's a long process. Healing and creativity, they both take time. Another paper um, on looking at future teachers, so student teachers, and these comparisons are interesting. Ukraine and Poland in this particular paper. Um, Many of you are very experienced teachers of many different subjects, including English. But if any of you are new teachers within your first couple of years, do let me know in the chat bar, because this particular study was looking at again a comparative study, but again looking at teachers of the future in Ukraine and in Poland. And um, yet another paper, again from 2022, on Paulo Freire, who is probably one of the most cited researchers historically, because he saw education as a way of addressing social inequities. Brazilian educator, passed away some years ago. But this idea that education should be to help reduce the gap between those that have and those that have not. And it's been a struggle for me. I came into education wanting to make the world a better place, wanting to reduce that gap between my students who are guaranteed a wonderful life because of their parents and their grandparents and their historical wealth and privilege, and those students for whom education is a way to break a cycle of poverty and inequity, as it was for me and my generation. So those of you who've been here before know that I pay a lot of attention to context. And again, last week in Tampa, I asked questions to the presenters about research they'd read about their own context, and many of them had not. read a lot of research about their own context, which I thought was interesting, given how important context is. So last month, February 2024, here we are on the cusp of April, the first quarter of the year gone already, which is always a scary thought. So Professor Barbara Kerr at the University of Kansas is one of the people who has looked at the personality characteristics. Very creative people have recurring personalities, and I'm talking here about teachers and students. And I should say that some of the most creative lessons that I've seen all around the world have been from, in fact, in some cases, younger, less experienced teachers. So they were willing to take risks, and they embodied some of these characteristics. Again, spending a lot of time in Asia these days, there's this idea that with age comes wisdom. And so an older teacher is perhaps automatically better and more creative than a younger teacher. And that's sometimes true, but I have found that in some very interesting cases, younger teachers and students are willing to take more risks. And I think this risk-taking behavior is not something that is addressed a lot in the literature. Some of the best teachers I've ever seen, which includes some of the presenters I saw last week, have maintained their creativity. And you can really see that. So Professor Kerr talked about autonomy and mastery. And something that came up last week, many of the discussions were about artificial intelligence and ChatGPT, which, to be honest, I find a little uninspiring. I know the technology is very important, but what we do as teachers is so much more creative than artificial intelligence, and so much more creative than ChatGPT. But I went to several presentations, and some of them talked about the relationship between intelligence and creativity, which is a big discussion in the literature. And I'm happy to say that it's not correlational and it's not causal. By that, I mean that there's a level of intelligence that some researchers call the threshold level, that beyond a certain level of intelligence, you're not a more creative person. And I would say in my own life, personally and professionally, some of the most creative people I met and some of the most creative people I know didn't go to university, but they are extremely creative. So that's an important point when we're talking about creativity. There's a threshold of intelligence, and beyond that, you're just a really clever person, but you may not be a very creative person. And again, most of my comments today apply to teachers as much as students. And for those of you who are especially interested in creativity, you may already know about the work of Paul Torancy, 1966, which is before some of you were born, not before I was born, but before some of you were born. And so it's actually stood the test of time, the Torrance test of creative thinking. And one of the things about that test is that it's very, very language dependent. So one of the things I've been thinking about in this area is the relationship between language and creativity, especially in a foreign or second language. Um, I met a lot of people last week being very creative, uh, for several thousand people from dozens of different language groups, mostly functioning in English, being extremely creative in their communication. So I was thinking about that a lot today. Um, so that you can assess creativity. Some people have questions about creativity. Can you assess it? Can you teach it? Can you learn it? And the answer, I think, to all of those is yes. Um, One of my favorite people in this field has this magnificent name, um, Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, who is Hungarian, and some of you may know his work. Um, he I think a very creative, an example of extreme creativity is when someone is able to summarize this enormous number of extremely complex things in a single word. And for this researcher, the word was flow, Flow. And this idea of flow, of being in the zone, of when I'm preparing for talks today, today's talk, for example, once I started last week, in fact, the week before, digging into the literature and preparing the slides and reading about creativity and critical thinking in the Ukrainian context, I lost track of time. I was quite surprised it had been some hours that I've been doing this. Can you imagine how amazing it would be if we, as language teachers, our students just lost track of time, and when we get to the end of the lesson, the student said, "Really? Are we done? Is that it?" I've had a few of those lessons, but over 35 years, I've not had as many as I would have liked. But this idea of flow was is extremely important. Uh, Often the people who were very creative, and this is important as educators, often the people who were very creative had not had a great experience at school, elementary and secondary school. It was later in their life when they found they could be really creative. And in fact, the example that comes up a lot in the literature is Einstein, Albert Einstein. And he was not very good at math. And his math teachers said to Albert Einstein in a report, a school report, that he was really probably never going to amount to anything because he sucked at math. And this is someone who reshaped our understanding of the universe based on an equation, E equals mc squared. Entire books have been written about that equation, E equals mc squared. So for me, two things that resonated with me is that really creative people didn't have a great experience in formal schooling. They became more creative when they went to tertiary education, and that many of them had a very circuitous career path, which many people in our field have had. I started in clinical medical biochemistry and then made the jump to to language teaching and learning. Um, so if you're interested in this field and want to know more, I would say the work of this particular researcher is especially important. Um, this idea of flow, when we're really absorbed in an activity, is really important both for teachers and learners. Sometimes known as being in the groove or being in the zone. A lot of sports people talk about being in the zone, but it's this optimal state of intrinsic motivation. And that's really relevant to us because as language teachers and learners, motivation is this huge topic in our field. So when we talk about creativity and we talk about his work and being in the zone, we're looking at this optimal state of intrinsic motivation. And again, in our field, we talk about immersion in a very particular context for language education. And we also talk about fluency. I was pleasantly surprised to see how much the word fluency comes up in studies of creativity. But those guys don't mean what we mean. Uh, we're talking about linguistic fluency, and they're talking about ideological ideas, fluency of ideas, how many different ideas come from the teacher or the student in this period of time. So I was especially interested in his work on the ego, that our sense of self, we have to let go of our sense of self as a learner, not so much as a teacher, if we are to achieve this optimal state of intrinsic motivation. So he gave an interview to a technology magazine called Wired some years ago. And this is where this idea of the ego falls away, tempus fugit, time flies. And if any of you like to listen to jazz music, let me know, pop a note into the chat bar, because he used the notion of improvisational jazz music, where a group of musicians get together and they have a tune that they want to play, but then they all go in different directions. I think that's how language works. And language and music, the areas of our brain that control language and that control music, are the same, it seems. Recent studies of functional magnetic resonance imaging seem to support the idea that music, as a universal language in our brain, is closely connected to the learning of our first language and other languages. So this notion of the ego, I did see some egotistical presenters last week, but mostly the best presenters were the ones whose ego had fallen away, who were really concerned about the audience, who were really concerned, highly empathetic. Empathy comes up a lot in this research, I noticed, which I wasn't expecting, but I was very happy to see. So he came up with 9 components, and I won't read them out because when I was at the convention last week, some of the presenters just read out everything on the slides. I'm like, yeah, no, don't do that. Your audience can read. In fact, they can read in many languages, so there's no need to read the slides, every word on every slide. So those are the 9 components that, and I hope you can see that many of them relate to language teaching. Immediate and unambiguous feedback. That's a real skill to give in a language classroom. Immediate feedback and unambiguous feedback. So the more I look at the notion of creativity, the more I realize that maybe you can't be creative without language, and maybe language cannot be without creativity. So I think there's a lot of connections. I was looking at creativity in particular in education, as we're all educators, and one of the articles that I found relevant and helpful, and again, all of the articles I refer to in all of my talks are freely available if you have a stable, secure internet connection. I don't give out book lists anymore. So Tim Patson was talking about the notion of cognitive capacity, really, deep knowledge, new possibilities. This idea that you can take something that everybody has looked at and and seen, but you can see it in a different light as a teacher and as a learner. For me, as someone who likes languages and likes learning languages, I'm often coming up with very strange and creative connotations. So I'm trying to. My French. Canada is one of those countries that has two official languages. French is one of them. So I'm trying to learn French, and the word for hedgehog, not a very useful word really, but the word for hedgehog is hérisson. It's a silent H. And in the textbook, what they say is, um, my hairy son looks like a hedgehog, which is ridiculous because my son is not hairy and he doesn't look like a hedgehog. But the peculiarity, the absurdity of the expression, my hairy son looks like a hedgehog, um, means that I remember the word hérisson. I'm still looking for an opportunity. There was actually an entire French movie called Hérisson. So when we talk about creativity in education and language education, often we're talking about making connections that actually don't make any sense at the logical level, but at the creative level, they're a lot of fun. One of my personal heroes, I guess, in this domain, as a British guy, passed away at the age of 70 a few years ago. Ken Robinson, Sir Ken Robinson, came from a very poor family um, in a part of England called Liverpool, which is pretty poor. And he went on to become probably one of the best known people in the world, I would say, of creativity. He um, worked with many governments in the UK and Europe and elsewhere on trying to create more creative um, systems of education. And I can see that some of you know him. He was very cool, as Julia says. He was very cool and dispensed with a lot of myths about creativity. That creativity is not for special people. Creativity is not for special activities. Um, After this talk later today, I'm going to prepare a meal for um, for someone I care about. So I'm going to go to the kitchen and I'm going to have all my ingredients, and I'm probably going to not follow the recipe. I'm probably going to make some changes to the recipe because the person who's eating the meal I've known for a long time. So there's this notion of um, creativity being for special people and special activities. He disagreed with that, and I agree with him. And I'm glad to see that some of you know his work. And if you don't, I would very highly recommend it. He also has a very British sense of humor, which not everybody understandably appreciates. But his work on creativity, I think, is extremely important in the field. So he talked about misconceptions of special people and special activities and said, no, we are born with creativity. He said it comes with the kit, as in it's part of being human. Um, but some of our early educational and life experiences kind of beat that creativity out of us. And he was saying it's not this kind of wild, crazy, running around um, image that we might have of some extreme artists, Salvador Dali, um, Pollack, and other artists. It's a disciplined process and it's a daily path. And at the end of each day, I ask myself a series of questions. And one of the questions I ask myself at the end of each day is, what did I do today that was creative? And it can be a small thing. It can be changing a recipe. It can be a big thing, writing a paper, an article, or a chapter in a book. But it's a daily thing. It's not sudden. It's a process, and it takes time and it takes practice. So he made a distinction between teaching creatively and teaching for creativity. And I think we do both. Most good language teachers, most good presenters I've seen do both. But encouraging people to think creatively. And for me, and for my learners, and when I am a learner, that means making mistakes. So I have a lot of learners when I'm back in China. I have a lot of learners whose English is at a very high level. They're writing their PhDs in English. Can you imagine? I can't imagine what it is to write a PhD, a doctoral dissertation in another language, which is a higher level of fluency than 99.9% of the world's native speakers reach. But they make mistakes in their English, and they make mistakes at a very high level. So they tease me and say, "Was that a low-level mistake or a high-level mistake?" And often they're making mistakes at a very high level because they're being very creative in their use of language. And I encourage them. I said, "No, make as many mistakes as you like, because there are low-level, intermediate level, and high-level mistakes to do with the risks that they're taking in writing a PhD, a doctoral dissertation in English." This work on critical thinking is not new, and in my opinion, it's unfortunate that we have gotten so caught up in the technology and AI and ChatGPT and the internet and social media and anti-social media that we need to come back to, I think, creativity and critical thinking. As you can see there, this is not a new idea. It goes back to the 1940s. And some seminal researchers, at least in the English-speaking world, I think a lot of researchers in many other countries were doing work on creativity, but this is some of their most cited early work. And he found 12 characteristics. These are the first 6, often to do with recognizing the problem. A lot of people I work with are focused on solving a problem, but they don't spend enough time defining the problem. And so their solutions are not as successful. So problem solving is a big one, using language with accuracy, clarity, and in 1941, what he called discrimination, which has a negative connotation these days, but he meant using language accurately, clearly, and being very aware of the differences when we choose to use different language. Evidence and evaluation, conclusions and generalizations. So this is not new. I think it's still relevant, and I hope it comes back once we've gotten over our technology fixation, to look back at critical thinking. Sir Ken Robinson did say in a number of interviews that people often think of creativity and critical thinking as being opposed, that creativity is very freewheeling and critical thinking is very structured. But he rejected that dichotomy, as I do, because the people I know who are very creative are also very critical of their own work, of the work of others. So there is, in fact, many organizations that do nothing but think about critical thinking. One is the Foundation for Critical Thinking, and they came decades ago to a definition of critical thinking, which is there on the screen: conceptualizing, applying, analyzing, synthesizing, and evaluating based on observation, experience, reflection, reasoning, or communication. That's where the language aspect of our work becomes extremely important. more recently in the Harvard Business Review, HBR, they're always saying that things are simple. So a recent article I read was 3 simple habits to improve your critical thinking. No, these things are not simple and they are not easy. And as Ken Robinson pointed out, they take a lot of practice and daily practice as a process. But she identified 3 areas. Questioning assumptions is a big one. In my work, as some of you know, I have this little triangle of A, R, E. At one point of the triangle is assumptions. Another point of the triangle is expectations. And those assumptions and expectations are joined by the reality of the situation. So, what is the gap? People see me, as many people do, and assume that English is not my first language and compliment me on my English, which is always lovely. But it is my first language. So when they compliment me, or even better, when they say that my English is almost perfect and but could do with some improvement, that is their expectations. Reasoning through logic and diversity of thought. So questioning assumptions, I think, is an important aspect of critical thinking, and considering alternatives is also very important. And this notion of reasoning through logic and asking yourself these kinds of post hoc questions to do with evidence and proof, and the relationship between cause and effect. Is it causal? Is it correlational? Is it random? So questioning assumptions, reasoning through logic, and diversifying thought. If everybody in the room looks and sounds like me, then we can make a lot of very quick decisions, but they won't be very creative and they won't be very critical, because what I would need is a room full of people who look and think and sound and come from different backgrounds. That's why the convention we were at last week is so invigorating and so inspiring, because you spend a few days with people who see the world very differently and use language differently and think differently. And that's really where the criticality and the creativity comes from. So social media, again, as some of you know, if you've been to my presentations before or read my work, I do believe, and now it's not just me, now we have data, evidence, publications that show that social media is profoundly antisocial and has not helped our abilities to be critical and creative. In fact, quite the opposite. So I do always promise some time for questions at the end. We have about 5 minutes. I know it's Friday evening there for you. It is a beautiful Easter Good Friday afternoon here, but I would be happy to hear any of your questions. Please feel free to unmute if you can and ask them, or type them into the chat bar, and I'd be happy to take a few questions before we wrap up today.
So while we are waiting for the questions, I just want to thank you and all the participants for this webinar, because actually, you know, in Ukraine, many facilities are ruined now, and we had messages from many people asking for the recording because they won't be able to join. As for example, in Kharkiv, they have no electricity and so on. So as we have only 5 minutes, I'm doing my thanks and Thank you, Andy. And please, if you colleagues, if you have questions, we have Sergei Petrenko joining in. He's probably coming from the conference, and he was the one who noticed the time difference. So maybe he will have a question. Yeah.
I did notice the time difference. It gave me an extra hour to get cleaned up. um, Thank you all very much for your thanks and for being here. Olhas, I wonder if flow can be achieved when one is under stress. No. In the academic world, I tend to surprise people by giving one-word answers. They're like, really? Is that it? A lot of the people I spend time with give very long answers, and language teachers are really good, and language learners are really good at short answers. So no, I think it's really hard, and I don't know if it's impossible, but I think it's really hard to be truly creative when you're under stress. It's possible, but for example, they did a study some years ago and they asked Nobel Prize winners, where do you get your best ideas? These were people who won Nobel Prizes, and none of them said, in front of my computer at my desk at work. They gave them a series of options. Where some of the most amazing, there's a movie out about the atomic bomb, unfortunately, but it's an extraordinary movie about the scientists who worked on that and their creativity. And nobody who's ever won a Nobel Prize has won it at their desk doing routine work. Often they say we were out. There's a park outside my window here, and I see all the time people walking their dogs and their children. And they said that's when they get their Nobel Prize winning ideas, when they are out walking, often with a friend, talking about different things. So I think stress may be the opposite of creativity. I think it's very hard. Thank you so much for the question. um, I think it's very hard, if not impossible, to achieve flow when we're under stress. Now, sports people, NBA basketball players, they talk about being in the zone, and they are kind of stressed. But if you listen to the interviews, their ego falls away, and they're not paying attention to anyone around them. So I think not being stressed is probably very important in being creative. Methodologies to teach students to be creative. A great question again. I don't know if there are particular methodologies, but I do encourage my students to be very playful when they so one of my students came up with a joke the other day from China. She said, why do biology teachers and physics teachers always break up? I said, I don't know. Why do biology teachers and physics teachers always break up? And she said, because they have no chemistry, which I thought was just lovely. Now, this is someone whose first language is Chinese, being clever and funny in another language. That's so I encourage my students to be very playful. We use a lot of humor. We tell jokes that are not really funny, but humor is probably one of the most creative aspects. So using humor, I think, I don't know if there's a particular methodology. One thing I can say is that giving feedback to students who make mistakes, but make mistakes at a very high level, I guess that's a kind of methodology. I love it when my advanced students make mistakes because they're really creative mistakes. So, can we develop creativity without critical thinking? Wow. Yeah, thank you, Natalia. A great question. Creativity without critical thinking. As I mentioned earlier, they're often seen as being opposite, but I concur with Sir Ken Robinson. I think that very creative people are also critical thinkers. So I don't know if they develop at the same time, but they seem very, the area of the brain that seems to be in charge of creativity also seems to be in charge of critical thinking. So I don't know if you can develop them separately or if you would want to develop them separately. Playing with words, wordplay, puns, is creative mistakes, as you mentioned. So I know it is 8 p.m. On Friday evening there. I have very much enjoyed our 3 sessions together, and these will be the last of the sessions for now, but I'm really hoping to be able to meet some of you in person later this year. I will finish the talk there, and thank you all so much for coming. It's I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And we all hope to see you again, and probably in person. Let's start working at this and hope our next meeting will be a meeting in person.
I look forward to it. In the meantime, take good care.
Mm-hmm.
Stay safe. See you
Thank
soon.
you. Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you.